Rosehill Manor had not seen a carriage arrive with purpose in 3 years, and when the letter came in October of 1817, the whole house felt it before anyone read a single word. Eleanor Ashford was in the kitchen garden, pulling the last of the autumn herbs when the footman found her. Not her father, not her sister, her. Because everyone in the household understood by then that matters requiring actual attention were brought to Eleanor first and explained to the others afterward. She read the letter standing in the cold, her fingers still carrying the smell of rosemary, and she read it twice, because the first time she was certain she had misunderstood. She had not misunderstood. Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshire, was proposing a marriage arrangement with the Ashford family, and he was prepared to settle the entirety of Richard Ashford's debts in exchange for the hand of one of his daughters. Eleanor folded the letter with the careful precision of a woman who has learned to keep her reactions very close to her chest, tucked it into her apron, and went inside to begin preparing the household for a conversation that was going to change everything, though not yet in the direction anyone was expecting. The Ashford family had been declining for years with the particular slow dignity of people who refused to acknowledge the decline out loud. Rosehill Manor still had its carved stone facade, and its sweeping front lawn, and its east wing with the portrait gallery that Richard Ashford liked to walk through on winter evenings, reminding himself of the people he had come from and the standards they had maintained. What Rosehill Manor no longer had was the money to heat more than 4 rooms at a time, a full complement of staff, or any reasonable solution to the sum of £9,000 that Richard Ashford owed to 3 separate creditors who had long since run out of patience. Richard himself was not a wicked man, and not an unintelligent one, only a man who had believed for too long that things would resolve themselves if he simply continued to conduct himself as a gentleman and waited. The things had not resolved themselves. Eleanor was 24 years old and had understood this with perfect clarity since she was 19, which was when she had quietly taken over the management of the household accounts and begun making the kinds of calculations that her father preferred not to make. She had reorganized the staff, reduced the coal order, negotiated new terms with 2 of the local suppliers, and arranged the kitchen garden herself the previous spring because it was cheaper than buying vegetables. She had done all of this without being asked, without being thanked, and without, until the letter arrived in October, having any expectation that any of it would matter. Vivienne Ashford was 22 years old and looked as though the world had been designed specifically to frame her, which was not entirely her fault, but had not improved her character. She had her mother's dark eyes and her grandmother's cheekbones and a smile that drawing rooms tended to rearrange themselves around, and she had grown up understanding that these things had value in a way that made her impatient with anything that required patience. When Eleanor told the family about the Duke's letter that evening in the sitting room, with the fire kept deliberately low to save coal, and the candlelight making everyone's faces look a little more dramatic than the occasion strictly required, Vivienne's response was immediate and absolutely certain. She would be the one to marry the Duke. It was not a question. It was barely even a statement. It was the declaration of something so obvious that to name it felt almost redundant, the way one might say water is wet or winter is cold, because what other possible outcome could there be, and who in their right mind would imagine otherwise? Richard Ashford nodded slowly, looking at the letter in Eleanor's hands rather than at either of his daughters, and said that it seemed a reasonable arrangement, and that they would write back immediately to express their interest. Eleanor said nothing. She looked at the fire and kept her face arranged in the expression she had been perfecting for years, the one that communicated attentive calm while concealing the particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. If you have ever known what it is to be the invisible persons in a room full of people who love you, or believe they do, in their way, then you already understand something essential about Eleanor Ashford before the story has properly begun. If you are just finding this channel, we tell stories like this one every week, stories about quiet people, and what happens when the world finally stops overlooking them. So take a moment right now to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this one is only getting started, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Sebastian Blackwood had inherited the dukedom of Ravenshire at the age of 27, along with 12,000 acres of land, a 16th century hall that required constant and expensive maintenance, and a debt of £43,000 that his father had accumulated over the last decade of his life through a combination of poor investments, excessive hospitality, and a fundamental optimism about the future that had not been shared by the creditors. Sebastian was 31 now, and he had spent the 4 years since his father's death working with a focused, methodical intensity that had impressed even the people who had begun by doubting him. He had sold 2 smaller properties, renegotiated the terms of the primary debt, revived the Ravenshire farming operations through a new tenancy system, and reduced the household to a level of efficiencies that his late father would have found both admirable and deeply uncomfortable. He had done almost everything that needed doing, almost, because the one thing that remained, the one structural problem that sat at the center of everything else, was the Silverbrook mine. The mine had been the jewel of the Ravenshire estate for 3 generations, producing coal that had funded the hall, the tenancies, the parliamentary obligations, the charitable endowments, the whole elaborate architecture of what it meant to be the Blackwood family. And then the lower tunnels had flooded in the spring of 1815, and the operation had been shut down, and the cost to reopen it, to drain it, and reshore it, and make it safe and functional again, was somewhere between £8,000 and £12,000, depending on which engineer one consulted. Sebastian had not yet been able to find that money without dismantling something else entirely, and every option he had considered led to a different problem, a problem with no obvious resolution except one. He needed to marry, and he needed to marry someone whose family came with sufficient financial resources to absorb what Ravenshire currently could not. This was not, he had told himself on many occasions, an entirely cynical calculation. It was the kind of practical necessity that previous generations had understood without embarrassment, and he would understand it the same way, with his eyes open and his expectations managed, and his intentions honest to whatever woman he ultimately chose. He had asked his solicitor to compile a list of eligible families in suitable financial circumstances. The Ashfords had appeared on it, and the letter had been written. What Sebastian had not expected, had not budgeted for in any of his careful calculations, was what happened next. He arrived at Rosehill Manor on the afternoon of the 17th of November, 1 full day before the official introduction was scheduled, dressed in the plain coat and unpretentious hat of a travelling gentleman of no particular consequence, with a single bag and a story about requiring lodging for the night on account of a wheel that had conveniently required attention in the nearby village. The story was not entirely false. Sebastian had ensured that, having instructed his coachman to genuinely loosen the left rear wheel, enough to make the claim plausible before making it. He had done this because he had no intention of meeting a potential wife for the first time in a formal receiving room arranged specifically to impress him, where everyone's behavior would be organized around the fact of his arrival and the weight of what he represented. He had been deceived once, 4 years ago, by a family who had presented their daughter as a composed and thoughtful woman and delivered instead someone entirely different, and the experience had cost him 8 months of increasingly miserable negotiation before the arrangement had been dissolved by mutual and exhausted agreement. He would not be deceived again. He would see the family as they were, not as they wished to appear, and then he would make his decision. He had told no one except his coachman and his valet, and he had instructed both to silence with the particular emphasis of a man who means it. Mrs. Hartley, the Ashford housekeeper, opened the door herself, which told Sebastian immediately that the household was understaffed. Confirmed, by the fact that she then led him to a small parlour near the back of the house, rather than the formal drawing room, which would have required lighting a fire that was not already burning. The parlour was clean and simply furnished, and smelled faintly of dried lavender and something warm from the kitchen below. Mrs. Hartley apologized for the plainness of the room with the particular dignity of a woman who has been apologizing for things outside her control for a very long time, and has learned to do it without shame. Sebastian said it was perfectly comfortable and asked if there was any chance of tea, and Mrs. Hartley said she would see to it and left him alone in the parlour with the sound of the house settling around him in the November cold. He sat in the chair nearest the window, where the light was still good enough to read, and opened the book he had brought and listened. A house, in Sebastian's experience, was most legible when no one was performing for you. The sounds a house made when it thought it was unobserved told you more about its reality than any formal tour. And what Rosehill Manor told him in the first 20 minutes was that it was running on a careful combination of reduced resources and genuine effort, that the staff who remained were well managed rather than demoralized, and that someone was maintaining this place with a precision that the circumstances did not quite explain. The tea arrived carried by a young housemaid who set it down with cheerful competence and told him that supper would be served at 7 if he wished to join the family, and that Miss Ashford had said he was welcome to use the library if he preferred to read somewhere warmer. Sebastian thanked her and asked, with what he hoped was sufficiently casual interest, which Miss Ashford had sent the message, and the housemaid said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, that it was Miss Eleanor, sir. She manages the house, and then left before Sebastian could ask anything else. He used the library. It was a good library, well organized and clearly used, with penciled notes in the margins of several volumes that he examined with more interest than he had intended. Small, precise observations in a handwriting that were clearly the same person's across 24 different books. He was standing in front of the shelf where the estate management texts were kept, which was unusual in a family library and notable in its thoroughness, when the door opened and Eleanor Ashford came in with a ledger under one arm and a candle in her other hand, and absolutely no expectation of finding anyone there, because Mrs. Hartley had put the guest in the small parlour and had not mentioned the library. She stopped when she saw him. She did not make a sound of surprise. She simply stopped and looked at him with the kind of direct, assessing gaze of someone who is deciding very quickly whether to be annoyed and has decided against it on the grounds that annoyance is rarely efficient. She was wearing a grey wool dress that had clearly been let out at the seams at some point. Her hair was pinned up practically rather than fashionably, and she had ink on the side of her left hand. She said, simply, "I apologize. I didn't know the library was occupied," and began to withdraw. Sebastian said, "Please don't go on his account," and asked if the estate management texts had been organized by her. She paused at the door and looked back at him, and something shifted slightly in her expression. She said yes, they had, because her father found it easier to locate specific volumes when they were organized thematically. Sebastian nodded and said they were organized intelligently. She said, "Thank you," with the brief, self-contained courtesy of someone who receives genuine compliments less often than they deserve, and is therefore slightly uncertain what to do with them. Then she came in, sat down at the desk in the corner, opened her ledger, and began to work, and Sebastian returned to his book, and for the next hour they occupied the same room, with a silence that was, for reasons Sebastian would have found difficult to explain, entirely comfortable. She worked with complete concentration. He was able to observe this without appearing to, in the way that a person who has spent his adult life in rooms where attention must be managed carefully learns to look at things while appearing to look at something else. She did not check whether he was watching her. She did not arrange herself in relation to his presence in any way at all. She simply worked, and when she reached the end of a column and found something that made her frown, She went back through 3 pages of previous entries with methodical patience until she found the discrepancy, and then she corrected it, and the frown went away, and she moved forward. It was, Sebastian thought, watching the firelight move across the careful lines of her profile, the most quietly competent thing he had seen a person do in longer than he cared to calculate. Supper was served at 7 in the family dining room, which was warm and modestly set, with 4 candles on the table and a meal that was well cooked and sufficient without pretension. Richard Ashford was at the head of the table, a man in his mid-50s whose face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who has been worrying about money for so long that the worry has become structural rather than acute, visible in the set of his jaw and the way he moved through pleasantries as though they were obligations. He was courteous to Sebastian without being effusive, offered him the best chair without ceremony, and asked reasonable questions about the road south that had the quality of a man who is politely interested and genuinely distracted. Vivienne Ashford was on Sebastian's left, and she was, by any conventional accounting, extraordinarily beautiful. She had the kind of face that portraits were painted from, luminous and precisely symmetrical, and she had dressed for supper with a care that suggested she had been informed about the traveling guest and had drawn conclusions. She was also, Sebastian noted within the first 8 minutes of conversation, conducting herself with the specific brightness of someone performing charm rather than exercising it, deploying smiles and observations with a precision that had more to do with effect than feeling. This was not unusual. He had encountered it many times in many drawing rooms and dinner tables, and he did not find it offensive in principle, only in this particular context, at this particular table, for reasons he had not yet articulated even to himself, more noticeable than it might otherwise have been. Eleanor sat across from him and ate her supper and contributed to the conversation when it required her, which was less often than Sebastian thought reasonable, and twice offered a quietly accurate observation that moved the conversation onto more interesting ground, and both times the conversation moved there, without anyone appearing to notice where it had come from. After supper, Richard Ashford withdrew to his study, Vivienne moved to the drawing room to play the pianoforte, and Eleanor excused herself to attend to something in the kitchen, which Sebastian had already deduced was where she spent the majority of her evenings, managing the household's practical requirements. He said good night to his host and went upstairs to the modest guest room that had been prepared with evident care and very little fuss, and he lay in the dark and thought about the penciled margins and the corrected ledger column and the grey wool dress with the let-out seams, and he did not sleep immediately, which was unusual for a man who had trained himself to sleep efficiently as a practical matter of resource management. The following morning was clear and cold, and Sebastian rose early out of long habit and went into the garden behind the house, where the autumns had stripped the beds to their structure and the frost still held in the shadowed corners. He had his coat and his hat and a general intention of walking the perimeter of the property and thinking which was how he thought best. He had not been in the garden for more than 10 minutes when he heard voices on the other side of the low stone wall that separated the kitchen garden from the ornamental one, 2 voices, low and distinct in the cold air, carrying in the still morning with the clarity of things not intended to travel. He recognized them both immediately. He stood completely still. He did not move toward the wall or away from it. He simply stood and listened, because what he heard in the first 30 seconds made every intention of politely withdrawing irrelevant. Vivienne's voice was the first one he caught fully, and what it said was clear and deliberate, and said with the easy confidence of someone who has never had reason to moderate their frankness within the family. She was saying that the Duke was certain to choose her, that there was no possible reason he would look elsewhere, that the whole arrangement was simply a matter of conducting herself well for one afternoon, and she would have everything she had always wanted, the title, the position, the house, the freedom from all of this, and that once the marriage was secured, she would be able to manage her life exactly as she chose, which was the point of marrying well, wasn't it? To finally have the resources to do what one actually wanted, instead of what one was forced to do by circumstance. She said it with the light, practical tone of someone working through a travel itinerary rather than describing a marriage, the Duke himself appearing in her narrative as a means to an end of the most unremarkable kind, a door to open, a problem to solve, a transaction to complete. Eleanor's response was quiet and took a moment to come. Sebastian leaned almost imperceptibly toward the wall. Eleanor said that she hoped Vivienne would find happiness, and that she meant it, but that a marriage entered into as a transaction with no intention of genuine partnership would not be the kind of happiness that lasted. Vivienne made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She said Eleanor had always been like this, always speaking in principles, always finding the serious note in everything, as though that were a virtue rather than simply a habit that made everyone around her feel slightly criticized. Eleanor did not react with heat. She said, still quietly, that she only meant that whatever came after the arrangement mattered as much as the arrangement itself. That a house was not a refuge if the person you shared it with was a stranger to you, that she had watched their mother in this house, and she had seen what longing for a different life looked like from the inside, and she did not wish that for either of them. There was a pause. Then Vivienne said, with the particular impatience of someone who has heard a version of this before and has decided not to engage with it, that Eleanor could keep her principles, she would keep her options. There was the sound of footsteps, a gate, and then silence. Sebastian stood in the ornamental garden in the November morning, and the frost began to release from the shadows around him, and he thought about what he had just heard for a long time before he went back inside. He had arrived at Rosehill Manor with a plan. He had arrived with a clear intention and a clear preference and a clear sense of how the official meeting would proceed and what the likely outcome would be. What he had not arrived with was any expectation of being surprised. He had been surprised. Not by Vivienne, who had confirmed rather than revealed herself, but by Eleanor, who had said in a garden, in a low voice, that a house was not a refuge if the person you shared it with was a stranger to you, and who had said it without bitterness and without accusation, and without any apparent awareness that she was articulating the precise thing that Sebastian Blackwood had been thinking about Ravenshaw Hall for the last 4 years, without ever finding the words for it. He had been managing a house. He had been running it with discipline and efficiency and total dedication to its survival, and it had not for a single day in 4 years been a refuge. He had known this. He had not known that he had known it until a woman in a kitchen garden said it out loud while talking to her sister. The official meeting happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the Ashford drawing room, which had been prepared with evident and touching effort. Fresh flowers from somewhere in the kitchen garden, the best china, the fire built higher than it had been in any other room. Sebastian had visited. Richard Ashford was in his formal coat and seemed more present than he had the night before, as though the significance of the occasion had reached him more fully than the ordinary evening had. Vivienne was in a blue silk dress that was genuinely beautiful, and she wore it with the ease of someone who has always been told she is exactly what she appears to be. Eleanor was in the same grey dress, or one very like it, and she sat to the side of the room in the way that people sit when they have decided the occasion is not primarily about them. Sebastian took the chair across from Richard Ashford and declined the opening social pleasantries with more brevity than was perhaps entirely diplomatic, because he had been awake most of the night, and he had made up his mind, and conducting a lengthy performance of social ritual in service of a decision already reached felt to him like a particular kind of dishonesty. He said, looking at Richard Ashford directly, that he had come to make a serious offer, and that he preferred to do so plainly. Richard Ashford said that he appreciated directness and sat slightly forward in his chair. Sebastian said that his intention upon coming to Rosehill Manor, had been to meet the elder Miss Ashford and the younger Miss Ashford, and to make an arrangement with whichever of them seemed, on consideration, the better match for what he required and what he could offer. He said he had formed his opinion. Richard Ashford waited. Sebastian looked across the room. He said that he was asking, with her father's permission and her own consent, for the hand of Eleanor Ashford. The room became very still in the specific way that rooms become still when something has happened that no one was prepared for. Vivienne's expression passed through several things in rapid succession, none of which reached her face fully before the next one arrived. Richard Ashford looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has been handed information that requires completely restructuring his understanding of the last 24 hours. Eleanor herself sat with complete composure and looked at Sebastian and said nothing, and her face was entirely unreadable, and Sebastian found this, for reasons he could not have cleanly explained at that moment, the most reassuring thing in the room. There was a conversation after that, a necessary and somewhat complicated one, conducted with the careful restraint of people on both sides of it who had things they might have said strongly and were choosing not to. Richard Ashford asked whether Sebastian was certain of his choice, and Sebastian said he was. Vivienne left the room without causing a scene, which Sebastian credited to her, though the departure itself was eloquent. Richard Ashford looked at Eleanor for a long time, and Eleanor looked back at him, and something moved between them that Sebastian did not entirely follow, but recognized as the particular language of a family that has been through difficulty together, and has developed its own vocabulary for hard moments. Then Richard said that the decision was Eleanor's to make, and he said it in a way that suggested he meant it, which Sebastian found he respected. Eleanor asked to have until the following morning, and Sebastian said of course. He spent that evening in the library again, with permission this time, and he read without concentration while the house moved around him in its quiet November way. And at some point, Mrs. Hartley brought him tea without being asked, which he accepted as possibly the clearest signal he had received all day. Eleanor walked in the kitchen garden that evening for a long time. She had made practical decisions her whole adult life, decisions about coal and staff and suppliers and dinner and ledger columns, and those decisions had felt like decisions about the family, about the household, about the abstract ongoing project of keeping things together that had become her primary occupation since she was 19. This was different. This was a decision about herself, about what her life would be, about whether the thing she had told Vivienne in the garden this morning, that a house was not a refuge if you shared it with a stranger, was something she actually believed enough to act on, or simply something that sounded true when one said it to a sister over a frost-covered garden wall. She thought about Ravenshaw Hall, which she had never seen, and the Duke, whom she had met twice in circumstances that were nothing like an introduction. She thought about the library, and the way he had said the books were organized intelligently, without inflection, without performance, with the simple honesty of someone who means what they say because they see no particular reason not to. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the dining table, not with the evaluating gaze of someone calculating an asset, but with the focused, quiet attention of someone who is actually listening. She did not know if she could trust that. She knew that she was tired of the grey dress, and the ledger, and the coal calculations, and the invisible necessary labor of a life in which she was essential and unremarkable in equal measure. She knew that this was not a sufficient reason to make a decision of this magnitude. She also knew, and this was the thing that she came back to at the end of the garden in the full dark of the November evening, that she did not have the luxury of waiting for a better option, and that a man who had looked across a room full of available alternatives and asked specifically for her was, by any reasonable measure, a better option than most of what the world had offered Eleanor Ashford so far. She went inside and made her decision. She went to sleep. In the morning she told Sebastian yes. This channel has been building toward moments exactly like this one, and if you are watching for the first time, every story we tell is about the kind of person who does the work and waits and chooses well and receives, finally, what they have always deserved. So, hit the like button. Tell us in the comments if you have ever been the Eleanor in a room full of people who only see the Vivienne, and we will tell you the rest of this story right now. They were married in December of 1817, a quiet ceremony in the village church, attended by a small number of people on both sides, and conducted with the brisk practicality of two adults who had agreed on the substance of the arrangement and saw no reason to extend the formalities. Eleanor left Rosehill Manor in a dark green travelling dress that was better than the grey one, and worse than anything she would have chosen if she had been choosing for herself, with one trunk and a small satchel of books, and the feeling of a woman walking through a door she cannot quite see the other side of. Ravensshire Hall appeared to her first, in the late afternoon light of a December day, grey stone against a grey sky above a long approach of bare oaks, and her first impression was of something immense and cold and rigidly maintained, a place that had been kept rather than lived in. And she understood this the way she understood Rosehill Manor, by looking at the things that were present and the things that were absent and reading the distance between them. The staff who met them at the door were correct and well-trained and managed their expressions with professional precision, but there was underneath it the particular atmosphere of a household that has organized itself around the personality of its absent center for a long time and has become very accustomed to a certain kind of order that does not require warmth. The first weeks were quiet. Sebastian was not unkind. He was present at breakfast and at dinner. He was courteous in a way that had the quality of intentional effort rather than reflex, and he worked long hours in his study on correspondence that Eleanor was not yet part of and did not ask to be. They moved through Ravensshire Hall like two people who had arrived at the same destination from different directions and had not yet established which corridors belonged to whom. The house large enough that it was entirely possible to spend a day without seeing each other except at the appointed meals, and sometimes they did, and neither of them remarked on it. Eleanor felt the specific loneliness of a person who is not unhappy in any definable way, but is very far from anything that resembles warmth. She had come from a cold house to a larger one, and she had told herself on that November evening in the garden that this was better than the alternative, and she still believed that was probably true. But belief and feeling were different things, and in the first weeks of her marriage feeling mostly told her that she was a stranger in a house that was not hers. She began, because it was what she did, to make herself useful. She introduced herself properly to every member of the household staff, not as an inspection but as a meeting, learning their names and their roles and their tenure and the particular knowledge they each carried about how the house worked. She found the housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, to be a capable and somewhat guarded woman who had been running Ravensshire Hall at a level of self-sufficient efficiency that left little room for adjustment. Everything was immaculate, and Eleanor approached her with the deference of someone who recognizes competence without being threatened by it, and the two women arrived at a working arrangement within the first 10 days that was more functional than either had initially expected. Eleanor reorganized the linen system, which had developed an inefficiency nobody had addressed, reviewed the kitchen accounts, suggested 3 changes that would save money without reducing quality, and 2 of them were adopted immediately. She began to keep a separate ledger for Ravensshire Hall's household expenditure, not because anyone asked her to, but because numbers were her native language, and the ledger was the way she understood a place, the way other people might walk a garden or read a library. She opened curtains in rooms that had been kept closed. She asked Mrs. Alderton about the history of the formal parlour on the west side, which seemed to have been arranged and then abandoned, and was told, with a brevity that suggested the topic had edges, that it had been the late Duke's private sitting room and had not been used since his death. Eleanor thanked her, and moved on and did not push on the subject, understanding that there were things in this house that had weight she had not yet earned the right to lift. Sebastian noticed. He was a man who had trained himself to see the operational reality of things, and the operational reality of Ravenshaw Hall began in a way that was too gradual to mark with a specific date to be different than it had been. The corridors felt warmer, or perhaps just less cold, and this was partly the curtains and partly something else, something harder to locate. The staff moved through the house with slightly less of the careful quietness of people who are managing themselves around a source of tension. The kitchen produced better food at the same cost, which was an outcome he noticed immediately and traced back to the account adjustments without much difficulty. He began to look for Eleanor in the evenings and find her in places he had not expected: the library, the small room off the east corridor where the estate maps were stored, the garden in the early mornings despite the cold, moving through his house with the focused quiet of someone doing a thing she means to do and does not particularly need an audience for. He watched her from a distance at first, the way one watches a process one is trying to understand without interfering with it. Then he began to be present near her more deliberately, and then they began to speak about things that were not purely practical. And then the evenings in the library became a shared habit that neither of them had arranged, but that both of them arrived at consistently. And Sebastian found himself thinking about the day's work in terms of what he would tell her about it, rather than what he would record in the ledger. The first time they sat in the study together after dinner, in February, was because she had asked him a direct question about the Silver Brook mine at dinner, and he had given her the short version of the answer and seen from her expression that she wanted the longer one. And he had said, in the somewhat abrupt way of a man who has made a decision before he has finished deliberating it, that if she wanted to understand the mine situation properly, he would show her the actual documents. She had said yes immediately, and they had gone to the study, and Sebastian had put the full estate situation in front of her for the first time: the debt, the mine, the flooding, the cost to repair, the various inadequate solutions he had considered and discarded, and the fundamental problem that sat at the center of all of it, like a locked door. Eleanor had read everything in silence, with the same focused, page-by-page attention she gave to ledger columns, and when she had finished, she had asked 4 questions. And all 4 of them were the questions he would have asked himself. And then she had said nothing further for several minutes, and looked at the fire with the expression he had come to recognize as her thinking face, which was not a face of uncertainty, but of calculation. And he had waited, because he had learned by then that waiting for Eleanor's conclusions was more productive than prompting them. She had said, finally, that she wanted to think about it. He had said, of course. She had gone to bed. He had stayed in the study for another hour, and found himself unable to concentrate on the correspondence in front of him, which was unusual and worth noting. The following week she came to his study with a set of questions about the mine's original engineering specifications, and the week after that she had found a reference to an older drainage system in a set of estate papers that Sebastian had catalogued, but not fully read, a series of letters from 1743 in which a previous duke had dealt with a smaller version of precisely the same problem in the mine's northern shaft, and had solved it using a gravity-fed drainage channel from the hillside above. An approach that the current engineers had not proposed because it required knowledge of the terrain that they did not have, but that Eleanor, who had spent 3 weeks reading every estate map she could find in the East Corridor room, had. Sebastian looked at what she was showing him and did not immediately respond, because the response forming in him was not a professional one. He looked at the letters and the maps and the careful notation she had made in the margins, and he said, eventually, that if this were correct, it would reduce the projected repair cost by approximately £4,000. Eleanor said she thought it was correct, but that it should be verified by a surveyor before it was relied upon. Sebastian looked at her across his desk and said, with the first fully unguarded expression she had seen from him in 3 months of marriage, that he was very glad he had come to Rosehill Manor. Eleanor looked at him for a moment and said, with the particular precision of a woman choosing to be honest rather than careful, that she was beginning to be glad of it too. What grew between them after that was not quick and not dramatic and not organized around any single declaration or revelation. It grew the way things grow in northern winters, slowly and with enormous patience and without announcement. In the shared work and the shared evenings and the growing ease of two people who have discovered that they are genuinely interesting to each other, which is rarer than it sounds and more sustaining than almost anything else. Sebastian told her things he had not told anyone, about the 4 years of managing alone, about the specific weight of being responsible for the welfare of hundreds of people when one has not yet solved the central problem, about the loneliness of a large house that functions correctly and feels like nothing at all. Eleanor listened the way she did everything, with her full attention and very little performance, and she said things back that were worth hearing about what it was to be necessary and invisible, about the way she had learned to think of her own preferences as a category of information that was less relevant than the practical requirements of whatever situation she was in, and how she was not yet entirely sure what to do with the fact that something had changed. Sebastian said, on a March evening in the library with the first suggestion of spring coming through the tall windows, that she mattered to him, and he said it plainly, without ornamentation, in the way he said things he meant completely. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment and said that she thought she had known that for a while and had been deciding what to do with it. He asked what she had decided. She said she thought she had decided to believe it. The London season arrived in April with its particular combination of ceremony and savagery, and Sebastian and Eleanor came to it together as a couple 4 months married, which was long enough to have established a household and not long enough to have established a social position, at least not on Eleanor's side of the arrangement. Sebastian Blackwood was known in London, respected and somewhat feared in the way that capable men who are indifferent to approval tend to be, and his return to society after a 3-year near absence was noted and commented upon, and the new Duchess of Ravenshire was noted and commented upon with considerably less charity. Eleanor was not what anyone had expected, not fashionable, not socially brilliant, not from a family, with the kind of connections that would have made the match straightforwardly comprehensible, and the drawing rooms of Mayfair processed this information in the way. Drawing rooms always process information that confuses their expectations, which was by finding reasons to dismiss it. She was called plain, which was unkind. She was called provincial, which was reductive. She was called an odd choice, which was the most common conclusion and the least interesting one, and she heard versions of all of these assessments within the first 2 weeks and absorbed them with the same steady composure she brought to most things, which was not the composure of someone who is not affected, but the composure of someone who has decided the effect will not govern the behavior. Vivienne arrived in London in May. She had been brought by a distant cousin's family who had agreed to sponsor her for the season, and she moved through the social rounds with the natural effectiveness of someone who had always known exactly how to be looked at, and London responded to her with the warmth it tends to reserve for beauty that confirms its own sense of how beauty should look. She was not vicious about Eleanor in public, not directly, because she was too intelligent for that. But she was thorough in private. And the things she said in the smaller drawing rooms and the carriage conversations and the morning calls reached the larger rooms eventually in the way that everything eventually does. And by June, there were stories circulating about Eleanor's origins and Eleanor's manners and Eleanor's suitability for the position she occupied that had the particular quality of information that is not factually false, but is deployed with intent, arranged to create a specific impression by someone who knows what impression they are creating. The evening at Lady Beatrice Harrington's townhouse was a Friday in late June, warm enough for the windows to stand open on the garden, with 100 people arranged across 3 rooms, and the particular social electricity of an event where everyone present has come partly to see what will happen. Eleanor had been warned, by a woman she was beginning to think of as a friend, that something was being planned, without knowing specifically what, and she had come to the evening in her best gown with the particular alertness of someone who does not know from which direction the difficulty will arrive, but is very clear that they do not intend to be undone by it. The difficulty arrived in the form of Lieutenant James Sinclair, a man Eleanor had never met, who had apparently been provided with a story and a set of supporting details and an occasion to deliver them, and who had done so across a crowded room with the brisk conviction of someone who has been persuaded that he is serving honesty rather than performing malice, a story about Eleanor and a man in Hertfordshire in the autumn of 1816, specific and plausible and entirely false. The room heard it in the way that rooms hear things they have been half expecting, with the particular quality of attention that has already prepared its reaction. Eleanor stood in the middle of it and did not react in any of the ways that the story was presumably designed to provoke. She did not flush or stammer or deny with excessive heat or look around for rescue. She stood very still and looked at Lieutenant Sinclair with the expression she had worn in the Ashford drawing-room when Sebastian had made his announcement, completely unreadable, completely composed, and utterly present, and she waited. Sebastian was on the other side of the room, which was not an accident of position. He had placed himself there specifically to see the full room, and he was already moving before the end of Sinclair's second sentence, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the precise and unhurried certainty of a man who has decided what is going to happen and is going to make it happen without noise. He came to stand beside Eleanor and took her hand and looked at Sinclair with an expression that the room noted and would discuss in detail for several weeks afterward. And he said, to the room and not to Sinclair, that he was happy to address the story that had just been told, and that he would appreciate the room's attention for a few minutes. What Sebastian said in the next 5 minutes was not theatrical and was not a performance. He described accurately the fact that Lieutenant Sinclair had been introduced to the woman who arranged this story 3 weeks prior, and that the financial arrangement between them could be demonstrated, and that he was prepared to demonstrate it to anyone who wished to examine the evidence, which he had been gathering for 10 days, because he had known something of this nature was coming and had prepared accordingly. He said that he did not propose to name the woman who had arranged it, because she was Eleanor's sister, and because public humiliation was not a thing he wished to facilitate against anyone, but that if the matter were pressed, he was prepared to be more specific. He let that settle for a moment. Then he said something that the room was not expecting, and that Eleanor was not expecting either, which was that he wanted to explain why he had married Eleanor Ashford when the social mathematics of the occasion might have suggested a different choice. He said that he had come to Rosehill Manor a day early, dressed as an ordinary traveller, to see the family as it actually was before meeting it as it wished to appear, and that he had stood in a garden on a November morning and heard Eleanor Ashford tell her sister that a house was not a refuge if the person you shared it with was a stranger to you, and that she had said it with the conviction of someone who had thought about it deeply and believed it entirely, and that it had been the most honest thing he had heard anyone say in longer than he could readily account for, and that it was the reason he had walked into the Ashford drawing-room that afternoon and asked for her specifically. He said that he had not married Eleanor Ashford because she was fashionable, because she was not, or because she was well-connected, because she was not, or because the arrangement was financially convenient, because it had not been particularly, but because she was the kind of person who kept ledgers and opened curtains and organized libraries and made houses livable, and said true things quietly in gardens when she thought no one was listening, and that he considered himself in all the ways that he considered things worth considering, extremely fortunate. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something real has entered them, and the usual social noise has temporarily lost its footing. Eleanor, standing beside him, felt something that she did not have an immediate word for. Something that was partly relief and partly recognition, and partly the particular feeling of having been seen by someone who looked specifically for you and found exactly what they were looking for. And she held his hand and did not look at the room and did not perform anything. And she thought about a November morning in a kitchen garden and the thing she had said to her sister without knowing anyone was listening and what it had led to. And she found that what she felt at the center of all of it was something that she recognized as love, not the version she had read about in the books in the Rosehill Library, but the quieter and more actual version, the one that develops in libraries and studies and winter gardens and shared ledgers and honest conversations, and the gradual discovery that someone is genuinely interested in you as a specific person rather than a category. She looked at Sebastian, and he looked at her, and the room continued to be quiet around them, and it was, all things considered, the finest evening Eleanor Ashford had ever had at a London party. If you are watching this and you have ever done the right thing quietly and waited for the world to catch up, this story is for you, and if you want to tell us about it in the comments, we genuinely want to hear it. And while you are there, please take a second to like this video and share it with someone who needs this story today, because there are more of them out there than we think. Vivienne left the party before midnight. Sebastian had meant what he said about not publicly naming her, and he kept to that, and the version of events that circulated afterward was notable for what it did not say as much as what it did, which left space for people to draw their own conclusions without requiring Eleanor to be the one to supply them. Vivienne did not disappear from London society. She was not ruined in any absolute sense, but the particular quality of her social momentum that had been building since May lost something that evening that did not immediately return. And she was aware of this, and Eleanor was aware that she was aware of it, and there was between the two of them, when they met some weeks later at a cousin's event, a conversation that was brief and careful and not particularly warm, but was also not hostile. And Eleanor said that she hoped Vivienne was well and meant it, and Vivienne said that Eleanor had always been the serious one, and it did not sound, for the first time in Eleanor's memory, like a criticism. They returned to Ravenshaw Hall in July, when the London season thinned and the roads north improved, and the house received them in the way that houses receive people they have been waiting for. Which is not a thing that can be fully explained, but which Eleanor, who had spent years reading houses the way other people read faces, recognized immediately as different from the way it had felt when she arrived the previous December. It was not the same house. It was the same stone and the same corridors and the same staff and the same high windows looking out over the same northern landscape, but something had settled in it. Some quality of warmth that had not been there before, and that was not purely the result of practical improvements, though those were real and measurable. It was the quality of a place that has a shared life in it, rather than a managed one. And Eleanor felt it the moment she came through the door, and saw Mrs. Alderton's expression and understood from it that the household knew something had shifted, and was glad. Sebastian put his hand briefly on the small of her back as they came through the hall, not a formal gesture and not a public one, simply the gesture of a man who has a specific person he comes home to and is aware of that person's presence. And Eleanor thought that she had been right in the garden in November about the thing she had said, and that it was a very strange and very good thing to have been right about in this particular way. The surveyor they had commissioned in March submitted his report in August, and Eleanor's interpretation of the 1743 drainage documents was confirmed in full. The channel was viable. The cost reduction was £4,200, which was enough to make the repair of Silverbrook Mine a practical possibility rather than a theoretical one. Sebastian brought the report to the library, where Eleanor was reading, and put it on the table in front of her without speaking. And she read the relevant sections and looked up at him. And he said that the credit for it was hers entirely, and she said that was not accurate. It was the estate papers of his family that had contained the answer. She had simply read them, and he said that several generations of Blackwood Dukes had also not read them, and the mine had remained flooded. And Eleanor said that was a fair point, and felt the particular satisfaction of having solved a problem that mattered, which was her favorite kind of satisfaction, and had been since she was 19 years old, keeping accounts at Rosehill Manor. The work on the mine began in October, a year to the month after the Duke of Ravenshire's letter had arrived at the kitchen garden where Eleanor was pulling herbs. And the engineers confirmed within the first month that the project was viable and that the timeline was achievable, and that the mine would be operational again by the following spring. The 943 people whose families depended on the Ravensshire estate for their livelihoods did not know the specific details of how this had been made possible, but they knew that something had changed at Ravensshire Hall, that the new Duchess had opened all the curtains and reorganized the linen system, and was known to walk the village in December with preserves from the kitchen, and had been seen twice sitting in the estate agent's office through the tenancy documents, with the focused patience of someone who intends to understand things properly. And this was the kind of information that travelled through the estate, with a specific quality of warmth that was distinct from the information that had travelled before, which had been mostly about efficiency and correctness. And that was a different thing from warmth, and the difference was considerable. A year after that, Ravensshire Hall was the kind of house that it had not been in a very long time, possibly in Sebastian Blackwood's memory, and possibly longer. A house with a fire in every room that needed one, and a kitchen that produced food with generosity rather than mere sufficiency, and a library that two people used in the evenings, and a study where a duke and a duchess worked through problems together in a way that their predecessors had not developed and their contemporaries rarely managed in the village. With a kind to their families and their household staff, with a kind of matter-of-fact pride that had the quality of something genuinely felt. Sebastian was not the same man he had been in October of 1817, and he would have said so himself if anyone had asked him in the plain, unsentimental way that he said things. He was not warmer in any performed sense. He was not less exacting or less precise. He was simply less alone in the kind of way that changes how everything else functions, the way a ship changes behavior when it has a navigator who is also on the same side, and the difference was not visible in any single thing, and was visible in everything. Eleanor was not the same woman she had been either, but the way she was different was subtler, less a change than an expansion, the addition of rooms to a house that had always been larger than anyone had given it credit for. She still kept ledgers and organized things and thought in practical systems, and she would always do these things because they were her nature and her pleasure, and the way she was most fully herself. But she did them now in a house that was hers, and with the person who was hers, and for reasons that were not only obligation. And this was, it turned out, an enormous difference. The difference between a river held in its channel by the pressure of the banks, and a river flowing because it is going somewhere. William Blackwood arrived in the world in the second week of April, in the spring the mine reopened, which was the kind of timing that people in the Ravensshire village noted as significant, and that Sebastian and Eleanor themselves acknowledged with the particular private humour of two people who have learned to find the coincidences of their shared life quietly delightful. He was a very small and evidently determined person from the first moments of his existence, which Mrs. Alderton, who was present for reasons that had to do with Mrs. Alderton's feelings about things mattering, and her feelings about this family in particular, noted with approval. Sebastian held his son with the specific stillness of a man encountering something for which all his systems of management are both relevant and entirely inadequate. And Eleanor watched him, and felt the particular quality of happiness that has no performance in it at all. The happiness that exists because a thing is true rather than because it appears true. And she thought about the November morning in the kitchen garden, and what she had said, and who had been listening, and where all of it had led. And she thought it was, in the fullest sense of the word, remarkable. Rosehill Manor continued in its reduced and dignified way, without Eleanor to manage it, which presented real practical difficulties for a period, and then resolved itself in the way that things tend to resolve when the people involved are capable enough. When Richard Ashford finally asked the estate agent to manage the accounts, and stopped expecting anyone to do it invisibly for free. Vivienne eventually made a match in the following season to a baronet from Wiltshire, who was steady and kind and not particularly glamorous. And the reports that reached Eleanor suggested that she was neither as happy as she had imagined, nor as unhappy as she might have been, and that the middle ground between those two things was where most people eventually found themselves living, which was not a tragedy, and was not quite what she had wanted, and was real, which was worth something. Eleanor wrote to her twice a year and meant it, because she had never stopped caring about her sister, only stopped expecting her sister to be a different person. And this was, she had learned, the most useful thing one could do with people one loved, but could not change. There is a version of this story that ends with the grand gesture, with the public vindication, with the moment in Lady Harrington's townhouse when the room went quiet, and Sebastian said true things in front of everyone who had doubted. And that moment was real and it mattered, and Eleanor would not have erased it. But the truer ending, the one she returned to when she thought about what had actually changed and what it had been made of, was a sequence of smaller things. A kitchen garden in November, and a corrected ledger column, and a library where two people read in silence and found it comfortable, and a study where a problem was placed on a table, and two people looked at it together and found a 1743 document that changed everything. A hand briefly on the small of her, back in the entrance hall of a house that had become hers, a son who arrived in April, a fire in every room that needed one. The version of the story that is always truer than the grand version is the one made of accumulated small things, the ones that no one else sees, the ones that do not circulate in drawing rooms or get retold at evening parties, the ones that are only ever known by the two people in them, and that constitute in the end what a life actually is. Eleanor Ashford had spent the first 24 years of her life being essential and invisible in equal measure, organizing and managing and accounting for, and producing outcomes that were credited to other people or to the general smooth functioning of things. And she had done all of this without resentment, because it was her nature to do things that needed doing, and she had not known how to want differently. What changed was not that the world suddenly recognized her. The world does not suddenly recognize anyone, but that one man in a garden heard the true thing she said, when she thought no one was listening, and decided that a person who said true things when no one was listening was exactly the kind of person he wanted in his life, and had the specificity and the courage to say so directly, and had meant it, and had continued meaning it through every subsequent occasion the world provided for testing it. That was the thing, not the title or the house or the mine or even the moment at the party, though all of those were real. The thing was that she had been seen, specifically and accurately, and by someone who was looking for her in particular, and that this had turned out to be enough to build an entire life on. It is, when one thinks about it carefully, the only thing that ever is. If this story stayed with you, if you felt Eleanor's journey in the way it was meant to be felt, then you are exactly the person this channel was built for. And we want you here. So, please subscribe right now if you haven't already. Leave us a comment telling us the moment in this story that hit you hardest. Like this video, so that other people who need it can find it, and share it with someone who has been the quiet one in the room for too long. Because the stories that reach us are the ones that find their way to the people who need them most. And we will see you in the next one, which is coming soon and is worth the wait.